there are these highs, and sometimes the highs aren't like you sold X amount of records. It's the highs
Right.
are someone messaging you saying, hey, your song helped change my life, or it was like a soundtrack for summer 2019, or like was played at my, my spouse and I's wedding. Like these moments are like, wow, like, all right, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you for doing this. How are you?
Absolutely. I'm doing great as well. Thanks for having me.
Of course. My name is Adam, and this is about you, your journey in music, and we'll talk about the new record coming out at the beginning of next month.
Awesome. Great meeting you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah,
Sweet.
perfect.
Awesome.
Awesome, awesome. So this, like I said, this is about you. So first off, we always ask, where were you born and raised?
Ooh, born and raised. I was born in New Rochelle, New York, around Queens, Astoria. Grew up there till I was about 9, and then I moved to Winthrop, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. And sort of I've been in the Boston area since around 9 or 10, and
Okay.
I moved to Montreal, Canada last year. So sort of new.
Wow, you're in Canada now?
I'm in Canada now. Yeah,
Cool. That's
yeah.
awesome.
How about yourself?
I'm in Nashville now, but I'm originally from Southern California, from San Diego, and
Okay.
then I moved to Tennessee like a year and a couple months ago.
Okay.
So
Cool. How do you like it? So
fresh to the south-ish. Yeah, I love it
fresh
here, man. It's
out.
awesome.
Yeah, Nashville's
So
cool.
cool. Rad. Well, I guess before we get to your Boston experience, what was it like growing up outside of Queens in New York? I mean, 9, you probably have a little bit of memories from there.
Yeah, I do. I do. We grew up in a neighborhood called Jackson Heights, and I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood. I have no siblings. I'm an only child, but my
Okay.
parents, yeah, good memories. I still feel connected to New York in a weird way, even though I was so young when I lived there. Every time I go back, which isn't too often, there's a sense of, oh wow, I was born here and had the first sort of decade of my life here. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, it's changed a lot, obviously, as a lot of cities have, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of new businesses and just all sorts of things going on there, but it's always sort of nostalgic to go back and reminisce on those times.
That's cool. And what about music in your household? Is that a big thing or family musical at all?
Not at all, man. Yeah, I'm sort of the black sheep when it comes to music. I was super into baseball, and like my dad's side was like big sports, like baseball. Like thought I was gonna
Sure.
be a baseball player. Was like super into the New York Mets, and the music thing kind of came out of nowhere. In 7th grade, my friend showed me a Metallica song,
Oh,
and
okay.
like, dude, you got to check this out. And I remember watching the solo to one of their songs, and I was like, whoa, like I want to do that. And always liked and loved music, but I grew up in like a pretty Christian household where like a lot
Hmm.
of the stuff I was listening to was like Christian music, and
Hmm.
didn't really branch out of that till like middle school, high school. So sort of, yeah, found a lot of it on my own, and not a lot of sort of roots with like musicianship or even like parents being into records or anything like that. It was kind of just through friends and friend group, and then eventually playing, touring, and just learning about music that way. Yeah.
Okay, cool. You talked about baseball. Was that something that you did through middle school and high school, or you did you
Yeah,
quit?
little league,
Okay.
little league into middle school, and then there was actually a summer, I think it was 8th grade or 9th grade, where I had started getting into music, and there was sort of this overlap and affinities as you do have as a child.
Right.
And you're like, oh, okay, I'm baseball. Like that's it, like tunnel vision. And then started getting into music and stopped practicing, stopped really showing up to like the optional practices, and just started
Right.
guitar, and then eventually writing songs. And then from there, I remember there was a day I was just sitting in the dugout, and I was like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I just want to play music. I want to be home.
Yeah. That
So
must have been a pretty difficult day, though. I mean, I remember as a kid quitting baseball. Like it was a big. I didn't play like that long, but I mean, it was like to
yeah.
like go to your family and be like, you know what, I really, especially the amount of time you invested in it, to be like, you know what, I don't really want to continue doing this. Was that a difficult conversation to have?
I think it wasn't difficult, but it was definitely interesting because again, I kind of lived as my dad would say now, I was living, eating, and breathing baseball. Like I was your kid that like knew your facts, and like Cal Ripken Jr. was on the Orioles from this year to this year. Like
Okay.
I had the baseball card, so I was obsessed, and kind of found myself in those obsessive tropes as a kid of just really getting into certain stuff. So I think my parents were just, or my dad specifically, was like, okay, like it's more of like the music thing will be a phase, right? And one that maybe you'll grow out of. And I had my stint with skateboarding as well, and sort of grew out of
Mhm.
that. And music just kind of stuck in a way that it never left my purview. So
Sure. I feel
it
like
was hard, but it was sort of like cool, like it stuck around. So there's
yeah. Was it something that you became like you moved that obsession over to music? It's like I got to learn everything about this. I want to know all about this.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, I sort of have still to this day that sort of obsessive nature about learning about new things, whether now it's like photography, that I've kind of picked up during the last couple of years, or like learning a new language where I started trying to learn French seriously the last couple of years. So I sort of get in that mode of like something new and like really committing to like learning as much as I can about it.
That's awesome. I feel like we're similar in that way, but I would just like not in that like where I'll progressively move on, but it was like skateboarding for me. Like I knew all the guys, all the teams that people skated for,
Yeah.
what companies all these guys rode for, like all the same thing. And it was when it came to music, I don't play music, but I just became obsessed with I tried, I'm not good. And I could realize that very early on, but I would like pick up facts. Like I'd remember like, oh, so and so was on this record. I'd like nerd out on like the
Yeah.
liner notes and stuff.
It's fun. It's fun, and it gives you an endpoint to information, right? Where it's like you now have an industry or a field that you can throw yourself into and learn about the players and the history. And I loved history as a kid. So I think a lot of it has to do with that, just like learning about how things turned out the way they were and why, and what was, what preceded that. And it's
Mhm.
really interesting to see how all that stuff plays out.
Sure. So
Yeah.
with that Metallica, what was the first of all, what Metallica song was it?
It was one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was one. Yeah, Metallica was like one of the first bands I like really got into that, which is funny. Not that they still do their thing, but I don't really listen to that style of music or stuff anymore. But
Right.
yeah, fucked pretty hard with Metallica.
Okay. So it was one. And then did you get a guitar pretty quickly after that? I mean, it sounds like you like were watching the guitar solo and being like, whoa,
Yeah.
like I want to be the guitar, I want to be a guitar player.
Well, it's funny because of that sort of phase nature that I was talking about with being into skateboarding and
Hmm.
sports and then this and that. When I brought up the idea of buying a guitar to my parents, they were kind of apprehensive because they were thinking, oh, we're going to drop all this money on an amp and a guitar and lessons and all this stuff. And they were like, you know what, Kev, I don't know. We can't just give you a guitar. I mean, we didn't grow up super wealthy. So it wasn't like I could just ask for a guitar and it was there. It was like we had to
Hmm.
give up and all that stuff. So I actually to prove to them that I was committed, I remember I would watch these videos on Comcast Music Video on Demand. That was like a season of life where like Comcast would do these like music videos, and I would watch these videos, watch the guitar solos, and watch these like online lessons on my
Uh-huh.
TV. And I would cut out these paper cutouts of like a fretboard. I'd literally cut like a long fretboard and tape pieces together and drew 6 strings on there and started like learning chords on the actual paper before I got the guitar, just so I could like get a head start. If I got a guitar, I could show that I was like, no, I'm serious, I'm interested. So I did that for a while, and my parents like, okay, I think we're gonna have to get him a guitar for Christmas.
Wow, that's cool.
So
I've never heard of that. I've
yeah,
never heard of anyone doing that. Did it help at all? Like when you got the guitar, or was it like, oh wow, I got to push these strings
no,
down, my
I
fingers
think,
hurt, and
yeah, no, I mean, it helped in the sense where I think it showed my motivation and showed that
sure.
I was into it. But logistically speaking, I don't think there was any benefit to it. I will say, I think I realized 2 months into getting my guitar that my guitar had been out of tune the whole time. Like I didn't know what tuning was. Like sort of missed that episode
Right, right.
where I was
Like
like,
I don't need. What's this guy got this
man, this
machine for?
sounds
I just
weird. I was
get
like, I
through
got my
that.
finger thing, but I don't know. This sounds weird, and yeah, it's funny, but it all worked out somehow.
Sure. Okay. So when you finally get the guitar and you realize that baseball isn't something you want to continue with, were you writing songs at this point? Like how quickly did you try to write your own music, or were you learning covers right away, or how did you kind of start?
I was mostly 7th grade, 8th grade, just learning covers into like a lot of metal stuff, into System of a Down, Metallica.
Mhm. You were
Just
learning to play these metal songs on
yeah,
guitar?
yeah,
Oh,
and
wow.
I got them
Because the
pretty.
band doesn't sound like that.
No, no, not at all, not at all. Yeah, that's the weird thing about it. I loved that stuff, and that's what got me into guitar
Mhm.
altogether. So I wasn't even like songwriting, or I bought an acoustic way later. I had an electric. I had an Ibanez sort of
Oh,
G.
there you go.
Yeah, it was very, I still have it.
Crunchy.
Very crunchy. So I spent a lot of time doing that and started writing songs in high school, for my girlfriend at the time, and sort of that morphed into writing songs about life and love and loss, and then through that, I mean, I just started listening to more music and broadening, the palette, as they say.
Mhm.
But a lot of it started off as like, cool, I'm gonna learn a metal song and like learn the solo, learn this riff. Like, it was lots of riffs. It was just riffs,
Okay.
AGOs, and that sort of morphed into, I played in like a Christian metalcore band in high school too.
Okay.
Like, your sort of heavier stuff too. So there's definitely a background in like heavy music, but
Well, that was a whole scene for a long time. I mean,
oh yeah,
maybe it still is ish, but like, I mean, there was a bunch of huge bands that were coming out that were like, in that same.
yeah,
I mean, you guys are signed to the Nail, which was kind of like the pinnacle of all of that in the
yeah,
beginning, which is
absolutely.
huge. But I mean, that must be a trip for you to even be on that label, I would think, if
It
you're
is.
into some of those bands.
It is. We were heavily into those bands. Later, after middle school, there was like the high school years where it started getting into Under Oath and like more
Hmm.
like post-hardcore stuff. Um, and yeah, Tooth and Nail was very, very involved in that sort of whole process, integrally. So yeah, it's definitely a trip, and it's very full circle, and it's really cool to see them sort of growing and moving on, and how we're a part of that with sort of their new endeavors. So it's been really, really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool to see that label grow and do what it's doing. A good friend of mine, and actually my neighbor, he works for them. I'm curious if you know. I'll talk to you about him after. But
Okay.
yeah, he works for Tooth and Nail, and mainly on the gospel side of the label,
Tyson.
the BEC. Yeah, but yeah. Anyway,
Oh, okay. Sorry. I
yeah,
should have.
yeah, yeah. No, 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 no.
Oh,
No,
okay.
no, no, no. It doesn't even matter. I've brought him up on this show before, but
Cool.
anyway, it's so you're in this Christian hardcore band, and then when like was that something that you did through high school, and then what about when college comes around? Do you go to school for music, or do you go to school, and like how does your
Yeah.
musical life kind of evolve from there?
Um, did through all throughout high school, did the touring thing with those guys.
Oh,
I
you
mean,
toured in high school.
yeah, with that metalcore band. I mean, we went pretty hard. We thought we were going to be the next Under Oath for sure.
Okay.
Um, and sort of gave our all in that era of life, and glad we did. I mean, we met so many of the people I still talk to today around the United States. I mean, I met in like high school touring with that band.
That's
Um,
crazy. Like how big of a tours were you guys doing?
they were out to like Texas and back from Massachusetts. They were like month-long tour. We would just, our summer vacations would be just touring.
Wow. And your parents were
They
supporting of
were
this.
supportive
That's
of,
so
and I
awesome.
think it was through the guise of you're you're like using your band to like bring Jesus to people.
No, no, sure. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Right. So
That makes sense.
yeah, so there was that extra layer of justification of like, okay, we get it, which was cool, but very, very interesting to think about the level of like trust and sort of experiences we had at such a young age. But yeah, it was cool. I mean, still think back on some of those memories very fondly in those guys. But yeah, moved on from that. Uh, didn't go to, so I almost went to Berkeley, sort
Okay.
of did audition, got in, was like, ready to go,
For
and
guitar, or what were you going
for
for?
guitar, yeah, for guitar. And I just had this moment of freaking out about like the price of student loans and like what I was trying to accomplish, and like, do I need this? And had this like moment where I was like, you know what, I don't think I'm gonna do it. So I actually didn't end up going, and sort of just went straight into the music world, workforce, etc. So yeah, didn't do anything from college, but just kept doing music, kept writing. And then at that point I started writing more solo music, and that project eventually became what Valleyheart was, who had a lot of the members from that old band from the solo project. It sort of morphed into this like rock band that like cool sort of leveled out into like an in-between of like all the influences that we had been loving of more like rock, heavier stuff, and also more singer songwriter folk, sort of blending all those elements.
Hmm.
And that's definitely where Valleyheart was born from.
Amazing. Well, with that, the band from high school, what was your role? The guitar? Were you the
I
guitar
was the
player?
guitar and the clean vocalist.
Oh, okay. So you
Yeah,
do have a clean vocals. I was wondering if it was like heavy, because obviously your band now, you're not really. I mean, there's a little bit of it, but not so much, especially in the two new songs that I've heard.
sure.
Um, okay, so you did
Yeah, I
sing. And
did.
when
I
did you
did.
realize that you could sing? I mean, you have a great voice.
Thank you. It was pretty later. It was just primarily a guitarist for a long time, and in that band, I was just singing sort of background harmonies, and then I started getting more confident in my voice and my songwriting, and those kind of paralleled, and started writing more songs and singing more, and it turned into, oh, Kevin can sing, and sort of that shift happening. It's a weird shift where you're like, oh, I do this now, you know?
Right, right.
It's like almost like the language thing too. It's like, oh, I speak this language now. It's like, when do you say that? Because it's always a learning process, and I still feel like I'm learning about my voice
Hmm.
and trying to ameliorate my tone and all that stuff. So, but at some point, I was like, oh, I'm gonna do this. I can do this, I guess.
Hmm. Were you just writing like so? Once you decided to defer from going to Berkeley, and you're like, I'm just gonna do this music thing myself. Like, were you like, how did you navigate? Was it just like, I'm gonna start writing songs as a singer songwriter? Did that band eventually like dissolve? And like, how did you end up becoming doing more of the solo stuff, which ended up becoming now Valleyheart?
Yeah, I think there did the solo thing, and I still have some solo music in the works, sort
Hmm.
of for a different project. But at that time, it was very full band sounding solo music that I think at one point with the guys we were playing with, we're like, I think this feels more like a band. So let's transition it to that space. And that project kind of took a pause for a while and just sort of naturally morphed into to Valleyheart stuff in 2016, which is when we started the band.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, still write songs for the solo stuff, but haven't really been focusing on that since Valleyheart has been the priority. Um, so yeah, they're kind of parallel projects, but it's always been like a weird uh, or a sort of a unique focus of which one we're going to focus on now or later.
Sure, sure. Was there like what would you say like a validating or like a big milestone moment was either prior to Valley Heart starting or right when you guys started that continue like kept you moving forward? Like once you finished high school and you're like, okay, I'm gonna start doing this singer-songwriter thing and or more full band thing, like was there moments that kept you going forward? Or I'm sure there had to be like peaks and valleys of where like at one point you're like, ugh, like is this worth continuing or
Oh yeah, till this day, man. Absolutely. I feel like that is the journey of music for a lot of people, you know, and the journey of just doing any creative endeavor of
Mhm.
there are moments where there are these highs, and sometimes the highs aren't like you sold X amount of records. It's the highs
Right.
are someone messaging you saying, hey, your song helped change my life, or it was like a soundtrack for the summer 2019, or like was played at my, you know, my spouse and I's wedding. Like these moments are like, wow, like this piece of art that we made is like helping or impacting or adding and inspiring people's lives. And I think that till this day is what's kept me going. Uh,
Mhm.
but it's there's definitely valleys of it being hard just to do sometimes and logistically to keep going. And but I think as long as we're growing and still finding people to have those conversations with and writing honest music that connect with people, that has sort of been the fuel to the machine that is pursuing music for me always. um,
Okay.
yeah, it was just still writing music that people seem to connect to in that way, which was kind of always the driving force, just maybe
Mhm.
through different mediums, through different genres in the last 10 to 15 years. But that is definitely at the heart of what music I write.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it was an interview with you, or I read something or a quote of yours where you talked about like success and what that meant, and it was like like kind of what you just said as far as like record sales or whatever goes. It was like being able to do this, like just this, right? Like doing this as you're able to like live and play music.
Yeah, yeah. And that's some it's I don't know how it happens. It's still a miracle to me, but the fact that it's happening is really cool. But yeah, not to romanticize it. There's often these valleys of should you like this is a lot. Like this is a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of risks. So it's a balance that I think a lot of musicians go through, and I try to talk about it as much as I can because I think
Mhm.
it's easy for people to look. I mean, I do this with people, right? Where you look at what someone else has got going on and you're like, wow, like they're on the rise, like they got it down, you know, whether it's through music or life or relationships. But I find that when you sit down with people and you talk to them, everyone's like, yeah, like it's great, but there are moments where it's hard, and there are moments where you're doubting if this is the path, or you're having a tough week or a tough day. So yeah, that has definitely been the experience, but all in all, it still sort of propels me to move forward.
I love it. So once the band once you start Valleyheart, then obviously you're signed to Tooth and Nail. Was that something that happened later down the line? Like, what was the first, like, once the band's going, like, how does the band really get off the ground? Are you touring again right away? It sounds, I mean, since you had that experience, do you guys go to the studio and record something? Like, how do you, initially start the band?
Yeah, in 2016, we wrote an EP and we recorded it and started just playing locally. And then through that, I think developed a small following of people who were into us locally, but also regionally through streaming and people finding us online. And then that got re-released the following year in 2017 with 2 new songs, and that was the Nowadays EP. And then from there, just wrote our first full-length record, and then recorded that in 2018, and then also put that out in 2018. And then I feel like that record is really what put us in sort of people's purview of that. I don't know, just I feel like everyone shits on albums a lot nowadays, and like the importance of albums and all this stuff. My personal experience has been whenever we've put out an album, which is for this project just once, but I've done it with my old band, there seems to be that really seems to propel a lot of artists forward in the long run. Maybe not right away, because it's like a lot of music, and maybe like a single blowing up feels like a bigger thing. But I feel like an album produces or introduces an opportunity for people to really sort of like, oh, I get what's going on here. Like I see the parallels, I see the story they're trying to tell. There's just more of the identity of that artist there. So I feel like after that first record, people were like, oh, wow, like, okay, I sort of understand what Valleyheart is. And sort of slowly but surely started seeing people get into that album and being interested in what we were doing. And I don't know, that record seemed to really connect with people in a unique way, especially about concepts of faith. And I feel like that was the big thing that definitely helped keep it moving along. And then we released an EP last year. And again, the EP was great. But we're really excited to release this second record, which comes out in a little bit, because I feel like it's a continuation of that story from the first record, and I think it's going to be really exciting to see how it intersects with people's lives.
I love it. It's interesting that you said, I haven't heard that perspective, but it makes sense with an album being more of like connecting with the band and really understanding what the band's about, because you're right on when it comes to having a song that streams well or a song that blows up on TikTok.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in nowadays, I mean, in the current, industry, I would think like if you had a song that you put out and it got 5 million streams in the first 2 weeks, that would be great, right? Like people are going to be like, oh, blah, 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 blah. But then it's like, now what? Like, you're not like, if you have a record that people like, you have 200,000 people that are like, wow, this whole album's incredible. And they're willing to spend 15-20 bucks to go see you now because they know more than just the one single that you have out. Like that's such a better position to be in, and I think you have more of a connection with people. Whereas like just because you have a huge single doesn't mean that you're going to go out and play a 10,000 seat venue just because you have one song that people know.
Absolutely. And I've had friends who've had songs blow up on playlists and stuff like that, and they couldn't even sell 50 tickets in their hometown. It's a weird, doesn't add up. Don't get me wrong, it's super cool, and I'm not one of those guys that's like, oh yeah, like we got to get away from that and like songs blowing up on TikTok. It's like, dude, that's great, and like that provides a lot of joy for people's lives, and like that's super cool. I just feel like for us, the journey that we're on, like what I'm trying to do is maybe just like a slower cook, and just sort of digging those roots a little deeper and hoping, fingers crossed, that it'll pay off.
No, for sure. No, and I'm not trying to downplay people's songs blowing up on TikTok or whatever, but it's just like, I feel like for longevity, you'd probably rather be in the position of, I have this album, maybe I have a third of the streams that maybe one person's one song has, but I know that these are people that have invested in my band, are willing to show up. I can see physical people that are connecting with the record. I mean, I'm sure that just has to be such a different, feeling.
Definitely, definitely, and very thankful to have those experiences still, and to no matter what scale, right? Because you're always like, well, could be more of those people, but it's like, well, at what point is it enough? So that's a constant thing where it's like,
Probably never, right? I
right?
mean,
'Cause,
yeah, that's the
even
scary.
your huge artist that blows up, they're still like Dua Lipa. You know what I mean? There's
Yeah,
still
yeah,
someone that has 2/3 more than you, technically, unless you're like, Justin Bieber or something. So I don't know. It's the idea of scalability and contentment and how those two things relate has been something I've just thought about for so long, because you're like, cool, like this blows up to like a point that a rock band can blow up. What does that mean? Am I like all of a sudden happy and content with the things I have in life? Probably not. Like there'll probably be something new if I'm not having my contentment under control and like rooted in the right things. That's not going to just get fixed when something like happens.
right.
So I try to think about that stuff. I don't all the time feel like I have it down, but it's something I definitely try to keep into perspective as we put out music and just live life.
Sure. Yeah. It's like you obviously don't want to be, you're not going to take these things for granted or like, but you always want to still look forward because it's like you're not going to stay stagnant and like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with the fact that I put out this one record and it did great. Like, as a creative person, you've got to always be looking like, okay, well, now what am I going to do? What can I do next? Like, I want to, not even, it doesn't even have to come down to the numbers and the people, but it's like, it's always for yourself. I'm sure it's like, I want to write a better record than this past record, or I'm going to work on something cool. Yeah.
Of course. And that parallels a big thing of life, just the dichotomy of contentment and change, where there's this constant struggle of, all right, I need to be content with what I've done, what I've made, who I am, the choices I've made, but also live in a space where I want to get better and improve and grow. But I find when I'm too much on that other side, I'm like, I just need to grow. Like I find myself forgetting to be grateful for the things. But then sometimes you can get sort of stagnant, like you said. So it's this constant balance of accepting the things you can't control, but then also realizing like, oh, there's still some fire in me to grow and to make something new and to maybe achieve some things.
Yeah, no, totally. It totally makes sense. When did you guys start the conversation with Tooth and Nail? Was that pretty early on? Like, did they put out Nowadays? Is that why you said you re-released the
No,
record with 2 additional songs, or that's just something you
that
guys chose to
that
do?
was a different label. But
Oh,
we
okay,
started
sorry.
working with Tooth and Nail more recently. Yeah, this is actually our first release with them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So this is all new. This is feeling fresh. It's feeling good. We started chatting a long time ago just because these conversations take so much time by the time you sort of solidify things. But they reached out, I think in 2019 or 18. And we talked for a long time and talked about
Based off of the success of that first album?
I think so. Yeah. I would assume that that's what sort of got our record on their desk, if you will.
Mhm.
Yeah, I believe so. And then from there, yeah, we started writing and so this next album, Heal My Head, will be the first thing we released with them. And it's really cool. They've been nothing but awesome so far and just supportive and really cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So where were you guys in 2020 when the pandemic hit? Like, if you had that record out, were you able to tour it enough? I mean, 2018, and then you're in a conversation. The conversation starts with Tooth and Nail, and then it's like the world comes collapsing. And then where were you as far as where this record's writing process was?
Right.
Yeah, like tell me where you were.
Funny thing about that first record that we put out, Everyone I've Ever Loved, was put out in the middle of December 2018. Like, album of the year lists had been done. The label we were on, they, not to like shit on them or anything, but it was sort of a situation where they just kind of were like, we're gonna just put it out. And it was sort of happenstance and sort of just like, oh yeah, like we'll just put it out. And there was no press. There was like just nothing, like just not a good release cycle, like nothing planned. And they were just kind of like, yeah, like it didn't really do anything. And I was like, okay. And I wanted to print vinyl because people started slowly, like through the course of 2019, people started getting into it. But it was your perfect situation of it wasn't like a big hit at first. And then like people got into it. It was this like thing that came out very quietly. And then just through time, it started spreading. I just saw people talking about it and And then we figured out a way to be able to make vinyl ourselves for it. And
I was gonna say, I think I've seen
Yeah.
photos on your Instagram where you have like a white vinyl of it.
Yeah. Well, the label was like, hey, we don't think it'll sell. And I was like, I think it will. But I was like, hey, that's fine. You don't have to do it, but can we do it? And they're like, yeah. So it worked out. I mean, we just sold out our second pressing.
It's huge.
Which is great, which has been really cool to see, like, wow, like people are into it. And, you know, yeah, it goes to show that you just do what feels true to your heart. And as cheesy as that sounds, like it will reach the people that it needs to reach, and you will find your people. So that came out, and didn't do much touring. Did a couple tours, did some East Coast stuff, some Midwest stuff. And then late 2019 into 2020, we were writing that EP, but that was kind of a weird time where we were in some transitions of members, and it was kind of a good time to figure out what we were going to do. But then into early 2020, we had our band set again and started writing. And right when the pandemic hit, it was like, well, I guess we're really writing. There's no choice here.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this album is definitely, as a lot of albums are coming out from various artists now, a pandemic record that we wrote all of 2020 into 2021 and recorded this time last year, 2021. So yeah, a lot of it came from that time of, I mean, I remember having practices in early 2020 where we didn't even touch each other, right? We were just in rooms, all distant, masks on, like, you know, we were all sort of pretty distant, but excuse me. But yeah, we did a lot of the writing in 2020, 2021.
Okay. I mean, you talked about how this record is kind of the next is in the next chapter, kind of the next part of the story from the first album. Like in that sense, like what, like, can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The first album, Everyone I've Ever Loved, really resonated with people that grew up in the church. Seemed like, because a lot of those songs were about experiences I had growing up in evangelical Christianity, growing up with sort of that background in faith and the identity that comes with that, being really, really rooted in that. And, you know, it's funny, a lot of people now seem to be like, oh, like there's this word deconstruction that's like going around. It's sort of a buzzword right now. And like, oh, this album was written for like a deconstruction anthem or something like that, where, you know, at the time, it was just writing about what I was going through, and no intention to write a church album or anything like that. Looking back now, it's one of those cool things that happens with records or any form of art, I think, where like you have an intention in making it, you have a vision, you do it, and then you take a step back, or like time passes and you're like looking at it, like hanging on the wall, and you're like, oh, like that's what that is. Like I didn't really see that when I was making it, but like now I really see what it is, you know?
Right.
So there was this like, oh wow, like this album is about identity, and it is about your formative experiences, and how there comes a point, usually in your early 20s or mid 20s, where you are faced with the choice to, what do you keep from that and what do you challenge? And that dissonance of the space between those two things can be really hard and can drive you into some pretty dark places. Whether it's in Christianity or in Buddhism, or whether it's in fundamentalism or any sort of set of beliefs that you're sort of instilled as a young person. So this next album, although it is not about evangelical Christianity, is still about identity, and it is still about understanding our place in the universe, and how it's still a guess, and it's still something that we're all living with. We're all living our lives and we're doing our things. But there is the weight of all these questions we have about our formative experiences, stuff we go through now, the griefs, the losses, the joys that we have in our life. And this album still sort of, when you walk away from that thing altogether that you grew up with, where do you land? And I don't think this album is saying I land anywhere, but it is still exploring the idea of where do you put your hope into?
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And with that, like, I mean, do you feel as if having a lot of time on your hands to like kind of reflect on, you know, the past album, and then like, I mean, I'm saying time on your hands with the pandemic, you know, shutting down the world, and it's like there's no real like time stamp on like, we got to get this record out in 6 months because of the label, and we got a tour to support blah blah blah. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, do you feel like you had more time to kind of sit with those ideas, and then was it like hard to be vulnerable with the record, or when it came to that piece, was that difficult for you?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it was one of the main motifs on the record is the concept of time and how it can get warpy and loopy and spooky when you are going through certain situations, and time can feel long or time can feel short, and life could feel like it's moving fast or it could feel like it's moving slow. So to write about that when we had this sort of time of just pause was really interesting. And I think for a lot of us, it caused a lot of self-reflection and sort of dealing and uprooting things that we were sort of used busyness, right, as like a drug to like distract us. And there was just things you had to face, and definitely experienced that personally. And a lot of the songs on this record are about uprooting those things. But yeah, it was a crazy experience to be able to do that during the pandemic, as for a lot of people. And I think the idea of time and having too much of it or not enough, or the feeling of how we spend our time and the anxiety around it, and all this stuff is definitely sort of the bedrock of what this record is about. And one of the lyrics that kind of comes up again and again on the record is "Take all the time that you want," which happens in a few songs, and wanted to sort of introduce the idea of feeling like time is short, life is short, but also if you live in the prison of that idea, you can feel claustrophobic walking through this life that requires you to maybe think, okay, I need to let myself grow and breathe and give time, just to remind people like we have time. Yet it is in the same hand, it is very fleeting.
Sure. Was there a particular song on the record that was like really, kind of difficult to address the subject matter, or like, like once you got out the lyrics or whatever the song, are you like, like, I'm so happy that that's finally like a weight lifted off me?
Absolutely. Yeah. There are two songs in particular, but one of them is called Warning Signs. It's the 8th track on the album.
Okay.
And it is stuff I was going through during the pandemic and a little bit before. Some just that stuff we were talking about of shame and all those heavy emotions that you could go through your life sort of living and not really opening those doors or boxes, but having to do it during the pandemic. And Warning Signs was about sort of navigating that process of opening up those things, but at the same time having like a partner, like being in a relationship, and how there's a temptation to not be vulnerable and to sort of think I'm better off dealing with this on my own. Like this is a mess. I don't want to drag anyone else into this situation. And that song was just about how do I love someone when I am figuring out I haven't fully been able to love and forgive myself. So to write that one from that perspective, and I honestly, like, to be very candid, I was struggling with like suicide stuff, and never had been in that place, and like had a new level of understanding of one night of writing that song and being in that really dark place. So to write that song, every time I hear it, even though it's one of the brightest sort of songs on the album, it's like sort of poppy. Definitely has the darkest. It reminds me of a very dark place, but it also encourages me of like, wow, I got out of that. And there's a line on that song that says, "But this won't be the end to my truth at the edge of my mind on the noose." And I know this is all very heavy stuff, and I apologize.
No, don't apologize, because
Yeah.
this is, wow. I mean, like, personally, I relate to this like on a very real level. Like, I mean, hearing you say that, it's like, for me to listen to you say that, it's like, oh, well, at least I'm not alone in that situation. Like, I have the same thing, you carry all this shame and this guilt, and it's like, if I can't love myself, like, how am I supposed to, bring on my wife and my kids and like
Right.
all this stuff? And it's like,
Exactly.
you're trying to do this balancing act. And the fact that, like, I mean, that last line you just recited to me, I'm like, whoa, like, that's so powerful.
Yeah. And that's what that song was. It was sort of letting out all those questions, but at the same time, this proclamation that I'm gonna just keep fighting for that person, fighting for vulnerability, albeit how hard it is. And I think that's a big theme on the record too. and in the song Vampire Smile as well, which is the fifth song that also talks about vulnerability and sort of showing your mistakes and like accept. The big thing is about accepting that guilt and shame and forgiving yourself for it and learning from it and moving on from those patterns, and how it relates in relationships to yourself and to others. So yeah, that those two, but specifically Warning Signs, the eighth song, that one felt like whenever I listen back, it feels like a moment in time that was really put onto the page and um really emotionally charged there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, dude, thank you so much for sharing that. Like I said, like it is something. It's interesting because my therapist has told me a bunch of times, like if so and so did this to you, like would you care? Like would you be thinking about it later, or would you just like accept their apology and move on? I'm like, well, yeah, just accept their apology and move on. They're like, well, why can't you you do that for anything about yourself? Like why when you do something you just beat yourself up and you can't like let it like just forgive yourself and go on? And it's like, I don't know. I can't it just gets you thinking about those.
Right. Absolutely. And I started therapy 2019 as well and have maintained. So my therapist has said the exact same thing. And it's true. And I think it has to do with us being the main character all in our own lives, right? It's, you know, in a movie, if the main character goes through a situation or like one of the extras happens in the background, you're like, oh, you're, you know, okay. But there's something about that sort of main character syndrome, which not that shame is rooted in narcissism, but I think there's a relationship between once you realize like, hey, we're all in this together, we all have a level of darkness we have to deal with at some point. I can't hold myself to that standard merely because if everyone held themselves that standard, no one would move on. Like we wouldn't have a functioning society, you know. But we just need to be vulnerable about these things and talk about them. And this is why I love stuff like this. This is why I feel less alone when I'm able to talk about it, whether it's through music. And that was a big goal for this album, was just to be able to talk about places like that and that, hey, like you're not alone in that, you know?
And I think that's the biggest thing people are going to resonate with, especially like hearing that conversation or hearing you say that. It's like, oh, well, this person also feels like that. Like, okay, now I have some like, you know, it makes you feel like you said, not alone. I think that's and the way that I mean, I haven't heard that song, but I've heard the two songs that you've released thus far off the record. And I love that you back that with, well, if you hear the song, it's more like upbeat and like pop, like not poppy, but like, it's a brighter sound. And I was thinking that when you were talking about it, I'm like, well, the numbers and the most recent one, I've just blanked. Your Favorite Jacket, like those are like brighter, like upbeat ish, more upbeat songs. And I feel like that's kind of what you guys deliver on with your sound and your style, but having that kind of undertoned dark, you know, like, you know what I mean? You're kind of not masking it, but you're kind of wrapping it up nicely to present it in a way where it's like, I'm not going to be, this is deep and dark and blah, blah, blah. But here is a way to digest it in this,
definitely,
more melodic way.
It's not a new tactic. People have done it, but I think it's a very effective one, because I think what happens is, for some people, for myself included, when you hand someone such a heavy topic like that, and then there's sort of like a dark, slow, like somber baritone, like that's great, but I think that just feels a little heavy for me sometimes, and I'm not always in that mood, and sometimes I am, but I love to be able to be like, oh, this is a jam, and then there's sort of an extra layer that if you really lean in, you're like, whoa, like there's something, this is not what I thought it was. And I love that aspect in so many aspects of life where like, oh, there's more depth to this person or this thing than I thought there was. Like I can enjoy it at face value, but if I want to lean in, there are these Easter eggs or these connections or this depth that I can tap into. And I think that just provides a contrast that's really unique that you can find in art that I find really, really cool.
No, I completely agree. There's not many bands that I can recall that are doing that as well as you guys have, proven yourselves. I think Saves the Day does a pretty good job of being, but not in that same, lane, but like, just having those, like you listen to his lyrics, you're like, oh my gosh, he's talking about, killing people or whatever he's saying. And you're like, but he's doing it in this like so poppy, like, presenting it in this way. But like, not that, like I said, I'm not comparing you and I'm not comparing your styles or even your subject matter, but it's just like having that similar, like, yin yang type
Yeah.
presentation.
But it's like mixing, right? It's like cooking. You're not gonna overload something. It's like balance. You got to find that balance to make something like each flavor pop. You don't want to like add too much of the same thing. So in that way, I think it's a nice balance of, salt and sweet kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
With the new record too, you recorded some of it at your house. Is that what I read? And you produced a lot of the record, mixed it. Like, tell me about that. Is this the first time you've done this on an album, at least on your own project?
Yeah. So it was, the way we're saying it is, it was co-produced, co-mixed, and co-engineered by myself and Kevin Billingslea, who was our producer for the last record, Everyone I've Ever Loved as well. And we love working with him, and he really does a great job in bringing out what the Valleyheart sound is and tightening things up and getting good takes out of us. So for our last EP, Scenery, we did some tracking with him, but I did a lot of the mixing and production myself, which was a lot of fun and a great learning experience, and had a great time doing that. But for a whole record, I didn't want to, take on that responsibility.
Not only do you have to write it, sing it, record it, and then do the
it felt like an impossible weight that I was like, I'm not in the headspace to do that without this falling apart. And I'd seen bands do that, like the whole production process themselves successfully. And I think there's so many bands that do that. Not so many. There are a few bands and they do it well. But I've also seen bands do it where they like break up because there's just there's no one.
They're just like exhausted at that point.
Yeah,
You're like, oh,
not good. You can't point to this guy or this guy or this girl. You're like, oh, this is like everything is us. Like this sucks, So I don't know. It didn't feel ready to do that completely, but I still loved a lot of the things found in mixing stuff yourself, or like having that creative involvement in the mixing process and the production process and all that stuff. So Kev was super open to letting me sort of like hop on ship with him and that stuff. And we found sounds together. And so what the process was, we did a lot of the demos before recording the record at my house, as I usually do. And some of the elements from the demos made it onto even the final master, like little key stuff, production stuff, even some like guitar stuff. But then we went with Kev and we cut the meat and bones of the record, the drums, the bass, the main vocal, did a lot of the lead guitar there too. And then after that, we rented out a studio for about a week and a half where we did a lot of the auxiliary elements there. And then anything we didn't finish up from there, I ended up doing in this room right here. And did like a lot of some backing vocals, some key stuff. But I really love that process because I think when you're with Kev, he works out of like a legit studio, and it's an expensive space, and there was moments where on our first record we had 9 days to record that whole thing, and part of me was like, I'd love to find this like weird feedback sound, run my guitar through a synth and run this through a pedal and then distort it on a tape. And I love doing that stuff, and I love finding production elements like that in places for records. But if you have a limited amount of time at an expensive studio and you haven't finished guitars or vocals, there's no justification for you to be like, let's spend 6 hours chasing this like piano sound,
right that might not even make the record.
Right, but I still find the importance to explore those things creatively. So having that contrast was really cool. We were like, cool, in this headspace we're gonna like get the backbone of the record, we're gonna make sure everything is solid. And then the time after in that record company studio, it's called the record company, where we rented out the studio, and then stuff we did on our own in my house and other places, there was that time to sort of explore little things creatively and little sounds, and like did a bunch of weird feedback stuff, and it had this blend of experimentation but commitment at the same time. That is sort of hard to find that balance. So I think it worked out really, really cool. And then Kevin and I remotely, we mixed a lot of the record. He would do like a main mix, and then we would hop on a call where he had an app that streamed audio from his workstation. The session would stream high quality audio into these headphones, and I would sort of listen and be like, oh, like let's bring this up a little bit. And instead of sending notes back to each other, we would just sort of mix in real time together.
Oh, that's cool.
And that was really, I know a lot of bands did that during the pandemic when they were able to meet up, but yeah, it was super collaborative down to the mixing process, and it was a great balance, I think, of those two things, like I said.
Amazing. It's cool too to hear that, like, this is probably something you'll do moving forward, I'd imagine, like being able to mix in this way, just because if you already know the person, you've worked with them, it's like, why am I going to drive all the way down here? We're going to build the studio, we're going to blah, blah, blah. When you could just be like, I can hear you. We'll go over this together real quick. Like it's way more efficient.
Of course. And I mean, props to Kevin Billingslea, because I think not a lot of producers are open to that. Like artists are coming in and being like, hey man, like let's do this completely different, or like, here's my perspective. And it definitely requires a lot of trust, because, mixing is weird. It's like music. There's a right way, quote unquote, to do it, but it's also subjective. And like, some people like the vocals super loud. Some like them a little bit more drowned out. Some people like the drums really up front in the mix. Others don't. So when you're having that battle of like, no, the drums are too loud, it's like, well, what does that even mean? Subjectively, yes. But, so you have to have someone that you're really in tune with. And I think that really trusts you and you trust them, that we're just not trying to sort of push our own preference, but more like what's best for the song. And that was definitely a challenge, but like a really cool exercise.
I love it, man. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. This has been great chat. And the record "Heal My Head" comes out the beginning of next month, 3rd or something.
Yeah, June 3rd.
That's so cool. Are you doing a tour to support it yet, or no? Okay.
Some stuff in the summer, but we're hoping to hit the road soon.
Amazing. And well, just off a random question, how long have you been living in Canada? Like, when did you move up there?
July of last year, so nearing in on a year almost.
Wow, that's awesome. Very cool. Very cool.
Of fun. I'm up in Montreal, so
awesome. So my last question for you is, I want to know if you have any advice for aspiring artists.
Yeah, I'd say nothing out of the ordinary, but focus on finding your voice, and not sort of your vocal voice, but what makes your sound unique. Don't be ashamed of your influences. I think for a long time, I when I got out of the Christian metalcore world or all that stuff, or even just my identity as a Christian, I spent a lot of time trying to like hide that, or like, no, I'm like not there anymore. But only recently I was like, that's part of who I am, for better or for worse, whether I agree with it or I'm proud of it or not. That is part of what makes my story unique, and the intersections of musical influences. So just own where you came from, own the influences that you love, own the things that make your sound unique and that make your life unique, and live that out.